Rome started as a small city in Italy and somehow turned into one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. But this isn't the story of Rome. This is the story of the man who changed it forever. This is Julius Caesar, general, politician, professional rule bender, and eventually dictator of Rome. He conquered huge parts of Europe, took control of the Roman government, and became so powerful that a group of his own allies decided the only solution was to stab him. Repeatedly. But Caesar didn't just appear out of nowhere. He wasn't born an emperor. In fact, for a long time, he was just another struggling Roman politician with big ambitions and even bigger debts. And Rome at this time, it was a republic, which basically means no king, but a lot of powerful people, constantly arguing and occasionally starting wars about it. So naturally, Caesar looked at this chaotic political system, full of rivals, egos, and backstabbing, and thought, yes, I would like to be in charge of this. What follows is a story of ambition, luck, genius, and a truly impressive number of bad decisions that somehow worked out anyway, at least until they didn't. This is how Julius Caesar went from slightly broke nobleman to the most powerful man in Rome, and how that went very wrong. So, before he was conquering Gaul, before he was crossing rivers dramatically, and before he was being stabbed by co-workers, Julius Caesar was just a kid, a surprisingly well-connected kid who still somehow managed to have a very stressful start in life. Caesar was born in 100 BC into the Julii family, which sounds impressive, and technically it was. They claimed descent from the goddess Venus, which is a bold claim, but in Rome, that kind of thing actually helped. The problem was, they didn't really have the money to match the reputation. So Caesar grows up in this slightly awkward position of being important, but also not that important, which is basically the worst possible combination. Because now you've got expectations without the resources to back them up. And while all this is happening, during the 90s and 80s BC, Rome itself is not exactly stable. Officially, it's a republic, which means power is shared between elected officials, a senate, and various assemblies. In reality, it's a constant political battlefield. You've got rival factions, power struggles, and generals who are starting to realize that if you have an army, you can strongly suggest political outcomes, which is not a great long-term system. Then things get worse. In 82 BC, a man named Lucius Cornelius Sulla takes control of Rome. And Sulla has a very efficient way of dealing with enemies. He makes lists, and if your name is on the list, you're dead. These were called proscriptions, introduced around 82 to 81 BC, which sounds official, but really just means, congratulations, the government would like you removed, permanently. Now Caesar, thanks to his family connections, ends up on the wrong side of this situation. Around 82 BC, Sulla orders Caesar to divorce his wife, which is already not a great start. But Caesar refuses, which is bold, because refusing a dictator who has a list of people he's killing is generally considered a bad idea. So Sulla responds in the usual way, by adding Caesar to the list, meaning Caesar is now, officially, supposed to be dead. So Caesar runs. Around 82 to 81 BC, he goes into hiding, moves around constantly, and relies on friends and connections to survive. At one point, he's even captured, which is not ideal, when the government has already decided you shouldn't exist anymore. Eventually, through a mix of luck, influence, and people convincing Sulla to calm down slightly, Caesar is pardoned, likely in 81 BC, which is a very polite way of saying, fine, we won't kill you. For now. But this whole experience does something important. It sets the tone for the rest of Caesar's life. Because from this point on, he's not cautious, he's not careful. He's the kind of person who takes risks, ignores warnings, and just keeps going. Even when the situation is clearly dangerous, which is either very impressive or deeply concerning. And then, things somehow get even stranger. Around 75 BC, while traveling in the Mediterranean, Caesar is kidnapped by pirates. Which sounds like the start of a very bad day. The pirates demand a ransom, and Caesar's reaction is unexpected. He tells them they're asking for too little, which is not how negotiations usually work. He insists they raise the ransom, because he's worth more than that. Then, while waiting to be released, he basically acts like he's in charge. He orders them around, criticizes their behavior, and casually mentions that once he's free, he's going to come back and crucify them. The pirates think this is hilarious, because from their perspective, he's a hostage, making threats. Which is the moment where everyone collectively realizes, oh, he wasn't joking. By the mid-70s BC, Caesar has survived the dictatorship, escaped execution, being kidnapped by pirates, and then hunted those pirates down, which is already more than most people do in a lifetime. And he's still basically at the start of his career. Because next, he's going to Rome to enter politics in a system that is still unstable, still competitive, and about to get a lot more dangerous. Now, Roman politics is not subtle. It's competitive, expensive, and mostly controlled by wealthy elites, which is a slight problem because Caesar doesn't actually have much money. What he does have is charisma, and a very strong belief that he should be important. So instead of playing it safe, he goes all in. Public speeches, bold opinions, aligning himself with the people rather than the elite Senate, which makes him popular and also very noticeable. There is, however, one small issue. Roman elections are extremely expensive. You need to fund events, games, public works, and occasionally, let's call them, incentives. So, Caesar does the obvious thing. He borrows money. A lot of money. By his early 30s, around the late 60s BC, Caesar is in serious debt. We're talking, if this doesn't work, I am completely ruined levels of debt. Which would stop most people. Caesar's response, borrow more.
Enter Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome, possibly the richest. Crassus looks at Caesar and sees potential, or possibly a very ambitious man who owes a lot of money. Either way, he decides to back him financially.
Which is incredibly helpful because it means Caesar can continue spending money he doesn't have, but now with support. Then in 63 BC, at around 37 years old, Caesar runs for Pontifex Maximus, which is the chief priest of Rome. This is a big position, powerful, prestigious, and very visible. He is not the favorite. His opponents are more experienced, more traditional, and probably more sensible. Caesar's strategy: spend more money, make bigger promises, take bigger risks. And somehow, he wins. Which is great for his career and terrible for his debt. By 61 BC, now in his late 30s, Caesar is appointed governor of Spain. This is useful for two reasons. He gets military experience. He gets money, both of which he desperately needs. And for the first time, Caesar actually starts to stabilize things. He wins campaigns, gains wealth, and proves he's not just a politician, he can command armies too. Then in 60 BC, everything changes. Caesar forms an alliance with Pompey, a famous and highly successful general, and Crassus, the extremely wealthy financier. This becomes known as the First Triumvirate. It's not official, it's not legal. It's basically just three very powerful men agreeing to help each other dominate Roman politics, which works surprisingly well. In 59 BC, at 41 years old, Caesar becomes consul. This is one of the highest offices in Rome, and he uses it exactly how you'd expect. He pushes laws through aggressively, bypasses opposition, and ensures land and benefits for his allies. The Senate is not thrilled. But with Pompey's influence and Crassus's money, there's not much they can do about it. By the end of his consulship, in 59 BC, Caesar has massive political influence, powerful allies, and a growing reputation. But he still has a problem. His power depends on Rome. And in Rome, power can disappear very quickly. So he needs something more permanent. Something stronger, an army and a command. Far away from political rivals. So in 58 BC, now in his early 40s, Julius Caesar is given command of provinces in Gaul, which, at the time, is not fully under Roman control. It's unstable, unpredictable, and full of opportunities. And for Caesar, it's exactly what he needs. Because this is where he stops being just a politician and becomes something much more dangerous. Officially, he's there to govern. Unofficially, he's there to build power. Gaul is not fully controlled by Rome. It's divided into tribes, alliances, and frequent conflicts, which makes it complicated. But it also makes it an opportunity, because if Caesar can stabilize Gaul, he gets military victories, wealth, loyal soldiers, and most importantly, a reputation. Almost immediately, in 58 BC, Caesar finds a reason to go to war. A migrating tribe called the Helvetii is moving through the region. Caesar steps in and says, absolutely not, which leads to a series of battles that he wins. And just like that, his campaign begins. Conveniently, and this sets the pattern for the next several years. Problem appears, Caesar gets involved, Caesar wins, Rome hears about it. Repeat. Again and again and again. By now, in his early 40s, Caesar is proving something important. He's not just lucky, he's very, very good at this. Over the next few years, from 57 to 56 BC, Caesar expands his campaigns across Gaul. He defeats multiple tribes, forms alliances, breaks alliances, and gradually brings huge areas under Roman control. His army becomes more experienced, more loyal, and more effective because unlike politicians back in Rome, these soldiers are actually seeing results. And this is crucial. Roman soldiers aren't just loyal to the Republic, they're loyal to their general. And Caesar understands this perfectly. He shares victories with them, rewards them, and builds a connection that goes beyond politics. Then, in 55 BC, at around 45 years old, Caesar does something unexpected. He invades Britain. Not to conquer it fully,
just to show that he can. It's a difficult campaign, limited success, bad weather, logistical problems. So naturally, he comes back again in 54 BC, because if something doesn't work the first time, clearly, you just try again. The results are mixed. But the message is clear. Caesar is willing to go anywhere. Back in Rome, people are hearing about all of this because Caesar is writing about it. His commentaries on the Gallic War basically function as reports from the front that also happen to make him look extremely impressive. So while he's winning battles, he's also winning the narrative, which is arguably just as important. Then in 52 BC, everything gets serious. A Gallic leader named Vercingetorix unites several tribes against Rome, which is exactly what Caesar doesn't want. Because now, instead of fighting smaller groups, he's facing a coordinated resistance. This is no longer just expansion. This is a real threat. The conflict leads to the Siege of Alesia, later in 52 BC, one of the most famous battles of Caesar's career. And it's slightly ridiculous. Caesar surrounds the city, trapping Vercingetorix inside. Then another army arrives to attack Caesar from the outside. So now he's surrounded while surrounding someone else. His solution: build two walls, one facing inward to keep the enemy in, one facing outward to keep reinforcements out, which is either genius or completely insane, possibly both. After intense fighting, Caesar wins. Vercingetorix surrenders, and the rebellion collapses. By 51 BC, Gaul is effectively under Roman control. After years of campaigning, Caesar has conquered vast territories, gained enormous wealth, built a powerful army, and most importantly, he's become incredibly famous. Back in Rome, people are paying attention. But there's a problem. Actually, several. Because while Caesar has been away, things in Rome have changed. His allies are no longer aligned. Crassus is dead, 53 BC, and Pompey is now much closer to the Senate, which means Caesar is no longer part of a power trio. He's a threat. By 50 BC, now nearing 50 years old, Julius Caesar is at the height of his power, but also in serious danger, because the Senate and Pompey are starting to ask a very important question. What happens if he comes back? Back in Rome, the Senate, now heavily aligned with Pompey, makes a decision. Caesar must give up his command, disband his army, and return to Rome as a private citizen. Which sounds reasonable until you realize that without his army, Caesar loses everything, including his protection. So Caesar is left with two options. Option 1, obey the Senate, give up power, and hope nothing bad happens. Option 2, don't, which would mean open rebellion against Rome. This is not a small decision. This is the kind of decision that starts a civil war. In 49 BC, Caesar makes his choice. He marches his army toward Italy and reaches a small river called the Rubicon. Crossing it with an army is illegal. It is a direct act of war against the Republic. Caesar pauses, and then he crosses. According to later accounts, he says something like, "The die is cast," which is a very calm way of saying, "I have just started a war with my own country." There is no going back from this. Rome is now at war with itself. The reaction in Rome is immediate. Pompey and many senators don't try to fight him directly. Instead, they leave. They evacuate Rome and retreat to Greece, where they can regroup and raise a larger army, which means Caesar walks into Rome with very little resistance. Not bad for someone who just declared war on it. By 49 BC, Caesar is effectively in control of Italy. He takes the treasury,
stabilizes the situation, and presents himself not as a destroyer, but as someone restoring order, which is a very effective way of framing things. But the real fight is still ahead. In 48 BC, Caesar takes the war to Pompey. He crosses into Greece with a smaller force. Pompey, meanwhile, has the advantage: more troops, better positioning, and the support of much of the Senate. On paper, Caesar should lose this. The two armies meet at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. Pompey outnumbers Caesar significantly. This should be decisive. But Caesar does what he usually does. He adapts, uses clever tactics, holds his lines, and exploits weaknesses in Pompey's army. And somehow, he wins, decisively. Pompey flees, heading to Egypt, hoping to find support. Instead, when he arrives in 48 BC, he is assassinated by people trying to impress Caesar, which is not how Caesar wanted that to go. Because Pompey wasn't just an enemy, he was a former ally. Caesar arrives in Egypt shortly after, gets involved in a local power struggle, backs Cleopatra, and helps secure her position, which is a whole story on its own. But the key point is, Caesar keeps winning. Over the next couple of years, from 48 to 47 BC, he defeats remaining opposition across the Roman world. By 46 to 45 BC, now in his mid-50s, Julius Caesar has won. The civil war is over. His enemies are defeated, and Rome is his. Caesar is given the title of dictator, first temporarily, then for longer periods, and eventually, in 44 BC, dictator for life. Which is not a subtle title, especially in a system that is very proud of not having kings. Caesar doesn't just sit around enjoying power. Between 46 and 44 BC, he introduces a range of reforms. He restructures debt, supports veterans, expands the Senate, and improves administration across the Republic. He even reforms the calendar, creating what becomes the Julian calendar, which is actually very useful. So from one perspective, things are working. But there's a problem. Actually, several. Because as Caesar's power grows, so does his image. Statues are built. Honors are given. His face appears more and more everywhere. And people start to notice something uncomfortable. This is starting to look a lot like a monarchy. Rome, historically, really does not like kings. They got rid of theirs centuries earlier and built the Republic specifically to avoid that situation. So when rumors start appearing in 44 BC that Caesar might want to become king, people get nervous, very nervous. At one public event, a crown is offered to Caesar. He refuses it. The crowd cheers, which should settle things. But it doesn't, because now people are thinking, why was the crown there in the first place? Around this time, a group of senators becomes increasingly concerned. These aren't random enemies. Many of them supported Caesar before, fought alongside him, benefited from his victories. But now they see something changing. Not just a powerful leader, but a permanent one. Among them are figures like Brutus and Cassius, men with status, influence, and growing concern. Because, from their perspective, the Republic is slipping away, and Caesar is the reason why. So they begin to consider a solution. Not a political solution, not a legal solution, a permanent one. Because if Caesar continues, the Republic may never recover. And if removing him restores it, then in their minds, it might be justified, which creates a very strange situation. Because the same man who survived Sulla, defeated Pompey, conquered Gaul, is now in danger, not from enemies on a battlefield, but from people much closer to home. People he knows, people he trusts. By early 44 BC, Julius Caesar is at the absolute height of his power, but also closer than ever to losing everything, because the plan against him is already in motion, and it's going to happen in the heart of Rome. In a place he goes regularly, surrounded by people he doesn't see as enemies. It's March 44 BC, and at the height of his power, he is dictator for life. Everything seems stable. Underneath, not so much. In the days leading up to it, there are warnings, people advising caution, rumors of danger, even stories of omens and bad signs. According to later accounts, someone tells him, "Beware the Ides of March," which sounds ominous, but also not very specific. On the morning of 44 BC, Caesar considers not going out. There are concerns, hesitation, but eventually he decides to attend a Senate. Because, from his perspective, he's in control. What could possibly go wrong? The meeting is held in the theater of Pompey, which is slightly ironic, considering how things turned out for Pompey. Caesar arrives, takes his seat, surrounded by senators, many of whom are part of the conspiracy. One of them approaches him as if to present a petition. Then another and another, closing in. Suddenly, one of them grabs him, and then the first strike.
What follows is fast, messy, confused. Multiple senators, around 60 conspirators in total, begin attacking. Knives, panic, shouting. Caesar tries to resist, tries to defend himself, but he's outnumbered. Among the attackers is Brutus.
Someone Caesar knew, possibly even trusted, and according to tradition, this is the moment that breaks it. When he realizes who's involved, he stops resisting, and within moments, it's over. Caesar is stabbed 23 times, right there in the Senate. On the floor, at the foot of a statue of Pompey, which is a very symbolic place to die, the attackers step back, expecting relief, applause, maybe even support, because in their minds, they've just saved the Republic. Instead, the room falls silent, because what they've actually done is kill the most powerful man in Rome, in public, without a clear plan for what happens next. And outside, the rest of Rome is about to react. On March 15th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar's story ends. But the consequences of his life are just beginning. Because instead of restoring the Republic, this moment will push Rome even further into chaos. After March 15th, 44 BC, Rome does not celebrate. It doesn't stabilize. It doesn't return to normal. Instead, it panics, because removing Julius Caesar didn't solve the problem. It made it worse. The conspirators had a goal: remove Caesar, restore the Republic. But they didn't have a plan for what came next. And in a system already weakened, that creates a vacuum. And in Rome, power vacuums don't stay empty for long. What follows is more conflict, more alliances, more betrayals, and more civil wars, stretching from 44 BC to 31 BC. Because once the system breaks, it's very hard to put it back together. Eventually, one man comes out on top: Augustus, also known as Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. And in 27 BC, he becomes the first Roman emperor, which is exactly the kind of system the conspirators were trying to prevent. So in the end, killing Caesar doesn't save the Republic.
it helps end it. Because the conditions he created, the power he built, and the instability around him don't disappear when he does. They just continue. And Caesar himself, his impact is enormous. His name becomes a title. Caesar evolves into Kaiser and Tsar. His calendar reform shapes how time is measured for centuries, and his story becomes one of the most famous in history. Because Julius Caesar wasn't just a general, or a politician, or even a dictator. He was a turning point. The moment where Rome stopped being a republic and started becoming an empire. And whether you see him as a brilliant leader or a dangerous ambition taken too far, one thing is clear. He didn't just change Rome, he changed history. And that is who Julius Caesar was. A man who rose through chaos, reshaped a nation, and left behind a legacy that lasted long after he was gone.